Our first speaker today is Dr. Angelica Pesarini. Dr. Angelica Pesarini took up the newly created joint position in Race and Cultural Studies, Race and Diaspora and Italian Studies at the University of Toronto. She earned her PhD in 2015 from the University of Leeds, and she worked as a lecturer in race, gender and sexuality at Lancaster University. In 2017, she moved to Florence, where she designed and taught the course Black Italia at New York University's Florence campus. Dr. Pesarini focuses on the intersections of race, gender, citizenship, and identity in Italy, and her work explores dynamics of race performativity. She's also interested in the racialization of the Italian political discourse on immigration. She has previously conducted research on gender roles and the development of economic activities within some Roma communities in Italy. She also has analyzed strategies of survival, risk, and opportunities associated with male prostitution in Rome. Active in the Italian anti-racist movement, Angelica is the author of several publications on issues of race in Italy, both in English and Italian, and is a member of the Black Mediterranean Collective, which has just published the Black Mediterranean Bodies, Border and Citizenship. Over to you, Angelica.
Thank you very much, Combola, for this generous presentation. And I wanted to thank you and Dr. Morani for creating this important space of conversation. Today I would like to tell you a bit about a research I've done with a colleague, Carla Panico, on the re-signification of public spaces in Italy and the legacies of colonialism, how legacies of race, gender, colonialism are all embedded in the use of public space. And to do that, we compared actually two actions that happened in June 2020, namely what happened in Bristol on the 7th of June and in Milan a week later. So I just would like to show you a picture of the actions we are talking about. Let me see, just one second. Okay. Yes, I don't find the picture now. I will show you in a second, but we are talking about the statue of Edward Colston. As you may remember, he was a member of the British Parliament, and he had been awarded a statue in 1895, mainly as a result of his philanthropic works that benefited the city, and city known informally as the capital of the slave trade. A week later in Milan, on June 14th, 2020, a statue, the statue of the journalist Indro Montanelli, was covered in red paint with words razzista and stupratore, racist and rapist, written on its base. Montanelli, who is considered one of the most influential Italian journalists of the 20th century, took part in the fascist invasion of Ethiopia as a voluntary conscript. And during his stay from May 1935 until October 1936, he was 26-year-old at the time, he took as wife a 12-year-old Eritrean child named Desta, who apparently had bought from her father, as he said, and who he described as a docile little animal. On several occasions, Montanelli justified his act, claiming that this was normality in Africa. So we analyzed these events that followed the wave of protests in the US organized by Black Lives Matter in reaction to the murder of George Floyd. And as you may remember, in the days after the murder, people marched in the streets across the globe expressing indignation and anger. In the European context, these actions have been transformed into claims relating to the anti-racist and anti-colonial struggles present in the various nations of the continent. And so with my colleague, we decided to investigate what happened in Italy and in the UK in relation to re-signification of public spaces. To do so, we analyzed a certain amount of media coverage but also we analyze what happened to us, because as scholars and intersectional feminists, we were directly involved in this debate as we both shared our considerations at the time on politically engaged platforms. Although many users appreciated our considerations, a significant number of white Italian male commentators infantilized, patronized, and in some cases insulted us, devaluing our expertise and capabilities as scholars. So we use collaborative autoethnographic practices and self-reflexivity, and we treated our own experiences as data to be explored and analyzed. And so today, in the few minutes I have, I just would like to tell you a bit more about the context of this action and the personal experiences of sharing some considerations about legacies of colonialism in Italy by me, a Black Italian woman who is also a scholar working on issues of race. Race, a word that in Italy, we don't say. When we talk about race, people generally think about the race used by the Nazi project or during the fascist regime, while there is a sort of overlooking about the social, economic, and political connotations of race. First of all, to give you a context, we noticed how some differences, right, between what happened in the UK and what happened in Italy. The statue of Colston was torn down on June the 7th, and it was broadcast by several national mainstream media channels, including BBC Radio Bristol, which shared several videos on its social network profile, and the live demolition of the statue received about 8.5 million views on their Twitter feed. And also the media coverage provoked a plethora of live comments. So in Italy, but in the world, everyone could watch live the demolition of the statue, the physical removal of the statue. Also, this physical removal had some digital consequences because the day after the event, the location of a Colston statue on Google Maps was modified. So if you look at the Colston statue now on Google Map, it's interesting what you can see. Also on Twitter and Facebook, the use of two hashtags, namely Black Lives Matter and Rhodes Must Fall, contributed to making the event go viral. What happened in Italy? In Italy, the action against the statue of Montanelli took place around dawn. So in the early hours of the morning, by a small group of students with their face covered, who belonged to a Milan-based student collective named Lume. The action didn't have a collective dimension, nor it was followed by mainstream media in Italy, as in the case of Colston. The students claimed authorship by publishing a video, and this was posting on their Facebook page, but it reached only approximately 26,000 viewers. So in comparison to the 8.5 million views, you can tell already that was a big difference. However, the reaction of the Italian mainstream media was quite prominent, and it happened to be strongly hegemonized by a handful of prominent voices of high-profile white Italian middle-aged male journalists and intellectuals working for national newspapers and television. And it's important to say these people all identified as sons of Montanelli, because Indro Montanelli had mentored them in their professions. And we are talking about very important figures, for example, directors of national news program, journalists, writers, opinion leaders, editors, so people who have a lot of space in the Italian television settings. So these intellectuals perceive themselves as entitled storytellers of their time, and they firmly believe, as my colleague Carla Panico said, to be the holders of a certain historical truth. Plus, due to their privileged access to mainstream media, they defended Montanelli in all of their editorial pieces, columns, and TV programs. But despite this high power position, we noticed that they occupy what Linda Alcoff called a fragile epistemological position due to what she defines a cognitive dysfunction. So what does it mean? That this dysfunction is manifested through an inverted epistemology, what she calls an epistemology of ignorance, able to produce some peculiar results. In fact, the results are white people's inability to understand, and I'm quoting Charles Mills here, the world they made themselves, and they overlook certain important aspects of the world. Also, Linda Alcoff highlights how subjects located in a position of cognitive dysfunction end up reinforcing their inability to recognize themselves as oppressors. And this is a key feature of hegemonic groups. And so we notice how the so-called Montanelli question in the mainstream media deliberately in Italy overlooked issues of colonialism, heteropatriarchy, and sexism in Italian history, as well as the debate on symbols in public spaces. And how did they do that? Well, they legitimized those who defended the action on social media. And it's interesting because on social media, the conversation took a different direction since many users and organizations sought to speak out against this narrative provided by mainstream media. But as I mentioned at the beginning, and I have 5 minutes left, we were involved in this debate as feminist scholars, but also from our different perspectives and positionalities. So I would like to talk a bit about my experience at the time. On June 6, I published a piece on a blog called Il Lavoro Culturale. This was a piece I wrote on a sleepless night. I really couldn't sleep thinking about what happened to George Floyd, but what happened in Italy. In June 2018 was the anniversary of the death of a Black man, Soumaila Sacco, who was killed in a brutal way in the south of Italy. He was a trade unionist picking tomatoes for €2.50 a day. And so I was asking why many Italians, white Italians, were protesting for the murder of George Floyd, a man killed on the other side of the ocean, whereas similar degrees of empathy, indignation, and anger was not shown for the death of the many Black women and men killed in Italy. And so I tried to question a bit the performative anti-racism and a lack of awareness of positionality and the denial of racism in Italy. So unexpectedly, I have to say, the piece gained traction on the social media, and the majority of the users who read and reposted the article appreciated my reflections on performative anti-racism and the need for white Italians to position themselves. However, it's interesting because the only criticism I received were all from white Italian men, seemingly ranging from their mid-20s to their mid-60s. And in their criticism, they pointed out at my lack of historical knowledge, my inappropriate focus on racism, telling me that the death of George Floyd was not an issue of racism, but an issue of class. I was also called a racist, amongst others things. But I have to say the issue that triggered the most heated responses was my mentioning of white privilege, that they called a form of reverse racism. One user argued that in my piece was an insult to history and a new vulgar form of racial prejudice. I'm quoting here. Another asked why I was singling out my voice, by mentioning race and questioning privilege. And another user wrote a total of 1,537 words comment explaining to me why my analysis was poor and intellectually lazy, and how my accusation to white straight Italian men, which were never mentioned directly in the article, lacked historical knowledge. And so in his essay, what he wrote was basically an essay, he provided to me a sort of structure of the all relevant historical events that I omitted in my analysis, which I'm not gonna list here because apparently there are many, and all the factors that made Italy the role of Italy minimal in its involvement in colonial matters. So I'm not even telling you what happened to my colleague. Unfortunately, she's an historian, so she was even more than me the target of insults and patronizing comments. But as I said, we analyzed these as data, and the reaction of the users who judged our competencies and abilities and who felt entitled to claim what and how to remember, in reality seemed to reflect the position of the white male media professional and intellectuals who dominates the debate in mainstream media in Italy. And again, following Mills, the denial of certain crucial historical facts is made possible and perpetuated, he says, by what he calls the management of memory. And I thought this was really interesting because collective and social memories not only provide the framework for individual memories, but are also closely connected with systems of knowledge production. And so social memory is not something natural, is learned and inscribed in textbooks, is emphasized and made present in everyday life through ceremonies, national holidays, statues, and monuments. And so the analysis of the debates about these issues in Italy revealed a certain perception on the idea of memory and the stages. So I can see my time is almost there. So I can stop here, but we can carry on later on in the Q&A. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Angelica. Was really stimulating and some aspects were really irritating. Thank you very much. And thank you also for quoting Charles Mills and his work, which is very important. I have to remember that you can send questions for Angelica through the Q&A feature. Our second speaker today is Dr. Natasha Fernando. Dr. Natasha Fernando is a visiting lecturer at the University of Westminster. Her doctoral thesis analyzed how resident migrant communities in Milan perceive the European migration crisis in order to determine whether there was communal solidarity or purposeful disengagement from growing discriminations. She's also a podcaster, and she has co-created and co-hosted Sconfini and is now co-speaker of Sulla Razza, the series translates English terms into Italian that have mainly been used in Anglo-American race ethnic studies, race, colorism, the N-word, one-drop rule, tokenism, and many more, and I'm sure she will say something more about it tomorrow. Our paper today is entitled Empathic Narratives. Over to you, Natasha.
Thank you, Combola, and thank you also to Dr. Marina Morani for really hosting this event. It's quite an honor, really, to be amongst such women who I admire and I read about as well. I'll just quickly share my slides. So today, really, I'll be talking about, the main themes that I uncovered during my research in Milan. that kind of revolve around empathy and the importance of self-narrativity, of narration and voice in order to enhance one's sense of citizenship as well. I'll also engage in a short discussion at the very end on what it should mean to be anti and racist today, some of the themes that Angelica also talked about in her presentation. Just a little disclaimer, firstly, to say that in the presentation, as I did also in my research, I'll be using terms such as migration crisis and generalizing terms such as migrants, immigrati, migranti, and extracomunitari, so doing this maybe a lot. But I use them in my research to denounce the labeling and nominalization provided in Italian media, and to follow kind of the public discourse as well that wants a certain other, right, as grouped all in one. But I myself do problematize it. So to begin with, really, my research aimed to uncover the perception that resident migrant communities living in Milan hold regarding the ongoing migration crisis. From July until December 2016, I conducted participant observation study and interviews in two specific areas of Milan, so Zona 2 and Zona 9 of Milan in the northern regions of the city, areas that are mostly densely populated by so-called migrant communities, residents. Instead of focusing on different ethnic groups living in the city, the research kind of centered itself rather on the study of locality. In fact, I wanted to study how prejudice, perhaps, is enacted on a spatial level, if it is spread through conversations, by informal relationships in the street, for instance, and the media consumption habits of itself of the participants, right? So how one is influenced by discriminatory mediatic discourses, if one is. The participant observation initially aimed to look at 12 migrant household units. They comprise of people originally from Peru, Ecuador, Philippines, Egypt, Senegal, Sri Lanka, Albania, India, Romania, who had lived in the city for more than 10 years. My primary interest was to see whether a so-called chain of discrimination really was continuing and was being reinforced by the then securitizing, still in practice, but then securitizing an exclusionary discourse of the far-right Italian party, the Lega Nord, which was first aimed at Southern Italians, putting Northerners and Southerners against each other, then Italians against, for instance, Albanians, Romanians, Black people, and then kind of all extracomunitari, right? Or extracomunitarie who lived in Italy. So yes, lastly, I kind of wanted to find out if this very last group of so-called immigrati and immigrate who had lived in Italy again for more than 10 years, now discriminated against new migrants that were crossing the Mediterranean. So people coming to Italy during the so-called migration crisis. During the initial interviews, the main questions the participants were asked were mainly on how they gathered news regarding the events. They were asked to define their position as well in the nation vis-a-vis the current debates on new migration and migrants and the general securitizing discourses on migration. This also led me to question their sense of belonging to Italy really and in the Italian society. In short, the main findings have showed that, contradicting my own hypothesis, there is no consistent discrimination towards newly arrived coming migrants from the likes of established migrants living in Milan. Most of the interviewees confessed kind of their desolation really in watching the Lampedusa events unfold on TV. They felt grief, of course, towards the mass deaths that were taking place and therefore criticized Italian politicians and the Lega Nord stance on the matter. But the main theory that rose during the research was firstly a question of identity and narrativity, right? And the different narratives that construct a sense of wholeness and identity in the so-called immigrati and immigrati that I interviewed. By questioning their positionality vis-a-vis the securitizing discourse of migration, what came out was how the narratives presented in the mainstream media impacted also their sense of belonging, of course, to the country and their sense of self. As addressed by one of the participants, Fatou, a participant originally from Senegal, it's either women who are murdered or extracomunitari committing crimes, or thousands of migrants dying in the Mediterranean. The narrativity is therefore defined by the media, and they are strictly grouped into categories of immigrati extracomunitari through the use also of nominalization, right? So the use of adjectives that identify and define a person for their ethnic cultural belonging. This ultimately kind of reinforces racialization and depersonalization, of course, of people. The narratives that they inhabit in Italy are static, with no possibility of development for themselves, development which perhaps solely comes through their own children, right? And as they see themselves as kind of locked into constricting, fixed, static narratives categories that block any possible type of development and advancement in the Italian society. So their narrativity is not which has the possibility really of becoming. This also signaled by the way, migrant issues, how they are concretely depicted on mainstream media. And an example that I personally noted, and that is not strictly, connected to my own PhD research really, but which I noticed on a separate occasion, highlights the exploitation of certain images. How, even when certain issues like the issue of citizenship, really, the jus soli, even when this is talked about, the images of Lampedusa are quite ubiquitous and took at that time center stage in those current affair news. I'm talking about the events in June 2017 when the citizenship law was being debated in the Senate, and which led to a little fight, to a brawl really, amongst the politicians. And the news pieces, though, in the main TV outlets that I examined and analyzed that covered this event in the Mediterranean, yes, showed the politicians, but they depicted, though, and used really the images of migrants, right, crossing the Mediterranean, migrants in camps and or tents and so on. Perhaps it was an attempt to obviously, I would say, maybe not perhaps, but to link the possibility of new migrants coming to Italian soil, having children, which would then become Italian citizens. A reality that in any case would be impossible, as the new citizenship law is not based on pure jus soli, right? But perhaps this is the link that certain mainstream outlets were trying to make, that anything to do with migration in Italy is linked to the Mediterranean journey, and is drenched really with the negative connotations that those same outlets apply onto. Even though other issues surrounding migrations are being debated on TV, the main images used are those that you see on the slide. So this was in 2017, as I said before, when the citizenship law was debated, and it still is. But again, and maybe, this source of representation has changed. But again, I'm using the specific events and its representation and reporting just to give you an example, of course, of the overabundance and overuse and misuse of images depicting the migrant journey in the Mediterranean. And this also takes me to a question, to question really the role of voice, right? So images of people coming to Italy, arriving on the shores of Lampedusa, denote really kind of a contamination really of images, right, as Mitchell argues, and a liquid scopic regime, as Federica Mazzara says as well. Depictions such as those of new migrants strengthen also the politics of pity as the contact between those who are considered the other, the extracomunitari, the immigrati, and mainstream audiences, though mainly white, is provided by media in form of images. Most of the participants themselves denounced the ubiquitous portrayal of the migration crisis in the media. Instead of being acknowledged, right, instead of the real struggle being acknowledged, though, those same people, the migrants, were rendered silent. So instead of really using their own voices to narrate what was going on, they're rendered completely silent. And instead of instigating compassion, though, towards new arriving migrants, this complete voicelessness was reinforcing hierarchical relations between fortunate and unfortunate, hierarchies between those who have a voice and those who don't really, which included also the participants that I interviewed as well, increasing the distance between those two groups and strengthening again the politics of pity. And it's these images that dictate the participants' own status in the Italian society, their own narrativity. There's an overabundance of images of the other who nonetheless is rendered, again, voices, and is incapable of defining himself, herself, themselves, and is seen, regarded to be really without agency. All this reinforces, of course, the subaltern position that those who are considered the other have. Spivak described these occurrences as part of practices of epistemic violence, the process that undergoes the silencing of oppressed groups. And regarding silencing, Christy Dodson emphasized firstly the need for reciprocity also in linguistic exchange, right? In order for people to be considered and consider themselves as residents, citizens in a society, in a democratic country. As she says, to communicate, we all need an audience willing and capable of hearing us, right? To the extent to which entire populations of people can be denied this kind of linguistic reciprocity, as a matter of course, institutes epistemic violence again. So one of the most important themes that surfaced in the research was the question of empathy, as I was saying before, as Angelica pointed out to as well in her research. In brief, with empathy, I refer to what Jodie Halpern kind of defines as a first person, like almost visceral understanding of another person's experience, right? A reasoning which causes to emotionally resonate with his, her, their experience and adopt that person's perspective, even if merely imaginatively. The main factor that made the participants empathize really with the migrants that they saw on TV, or that they heard about on the radio, was the constant perception of being seen as a threat, right? So that was a common threat, as a disease in society, and the common sense of exclusion that never ends. I was a clandestina as well. If we who are migrants don't help each other, we are lost. Italy hasn't given me anything. Why should they come here and suffer? As I suffered, we know what position we are bound to be occupying. We are migrants, we know what desperation is, what it means to come from afar in an unknown land and not be welcomed. And these are just some of the quotes from the observation which denote an embodiment of what it is to live as someone who is considered the other in Italy. Despite recognizing the limits of their knowledge, the interviewed participants were aware of their shared lived experience with newcoming migrants. They believed they held a relatable sense of strife with the people that they saw on TV. However, as I was saying before, the participants though questioned the empathic kind of emotional transfer that is involved by the likes of white Italians, which goes as far as remaining detached in such an engagement. What the participants observed was either the complete rejection of the figure of the migrants from the wider Italian society, or a type of empathy that, however, seemed to be dictated by political debates and affiliations. Therefore, for them, it was not really empathy, but a form of pity, feeding a kind of missionary white savior complex, right? Pity really is based on observation rather than action, and Arendt claims, by virtue of being a sentiment, pity can be enjoyed for its own sake, and this will almost automatically lead to a glorification, right, of its cause, which is the suffering of others. In this regard, as I mentioned before, the politics of pity really function on the basis of a difference between fortunate and unfortunate, where fortune and misfortunes are conditions permanently attached to people in order to separate the two groups. Pity tends to discriminate between the small and the great and generalize the distant, unfortunate other who is seen really en masse and generally without agency, reinforcing again exclusionary practices. So, the exploitation really of these images arriving in Lampedusa, of people arriving in Lampedusa and other camps, has widely desensitized people, one might argue, also in Europe in general, right? It has stripped away the real purpose that these images should hold. As Sontag said in her essay regarding the pain of others, the photographs are a means of making real or more real matters that the privileged, merely safe, might prefer to ignore. Our failure is one of imagination, of empathy, really. We fail to hold this reality in mind, the real reality. And in regards to the migration crisis, that which should be portraying real life and hence be fundamentally information is rendered almost as a spectacle, right? As De Genova explained as well. And this was really what was at the core in what the participants were saying, really. And this again, and I'll finish with this, this is where the title of the event, I think, comes into play, because this is the way I think what one might consider or reconsider how the anti-racist movement should develop in Italy. Perhaps through empathy, distancing from pitying missionary outlook towards the other, right? So working on a more kind of egalitarian kind of outlook of the other in Italy. So anti-racism lies in empathy, and I know, that this statement is quite problematic because, it kind of involves also further questioning, as it's difficult to grasp what and how one enacts empathy, really. There is the issue of it's being primordial, as I was saying before, the fact that, one might question, do you naturally have it or not, right? So I know that it begs really further question and doubts of the effectivity of an empathic embodiment and outlook, right? And this could possibly also be addressed afterwards in the discussion and question time. But now, I would firstly also perhaps like to examine what anti-racism itself is, and it means very shortly, I promise, in the context of Italy nowadays, because I think that when talking about anti-racism and appropriating such a term, we must be careful, though, of the ambivalent signifier that we attach to the word anti-racism. The meaning itself and the easy kind of speedy problematic labeling, right, that comes with it as well. We have to be careful, I think, in my opinion, in the steps we take as we engage in building an anti-racist movement in Italy. As many scholars examined when studying anti-racism, one of which was Alana Lentin, there has been a tendency in recent debates where anti-racist activists and scholars have problematized the concept of race, and Angelica also was talking about this. It's, the problematizing race itself without first fully engaging with it. This shortcut, though, doesn't truly acknowledge the racism that still exists and the experiences of racialized subjects. So in relativizing the experiences of racism, They're also assisting in perpetuating it. Yeah. So as Lenton explains, the resultant silencing of racialized experience is most pernicious, in that it often comes from self-declared anti-racist and thus ostensible allies. So before we talk about anti-racism in Italy, it's incredibly important, fundamental, to acknowledge the racism present in Italy first, as I don't think we've fully done that as a society. Of course, throughout this last year, more stories of racial abuse are coming to light, but this is only, I guess, the beginning, really. Because, however, it's undeniable that there still is silencing, and that as racialized subjects as we still are being silenced. The dangers of too quickly falling into a post-race reality are just too high, without fully acknowledging the racism still present. And it's perhaps a reality, that most, I dare say, left-wing leaning people might want to push for, inadvertently, unaware, though, of the damage they're causing to a true anti-racist fight. We can't go beyond race, right? If this doesn't really reflect the reality where we live in.
To interrupt you.
Yes, I'll just very briefly, also reconsidering what intersectionality is and that labeling as well. But yes, I was done. And some questions for the end, but that's it.
Sorry, but we were running out of time. Okay, thank you. It was very interesting, and I'm sure there will be questions in our Q&A session, and I ask all the attendees to send the questions to Natasha through the Q&A features. Our third speaker is Marilena Deli Umuoza. Marilena Deli Umuoza is an Italian Rwandan photographer, filmmaker, and author. She has a master's degree in foreign languages and literature and has studied cinema at UCLA. For the past 12 years, she has partnered with American Grammy-winning producer Ian Brennan. Her work has been featured in the likes of BBC, CNN, NPR, Rolling Stone, and focuses on artists from underrepresented countries like Rwanda, Malawi, South Sudan, Pakistan, Cambodia, and Romania. The work won a Grammy in 2012 and an Emmy in 2016 for the Grammy-nominated record Zomba Prison Project. Marilena is also a rights activist who has written 2 books about racism in Italy. These books are based on her personal experience growing up with an immigrant mother in one of Italy's most conservative regions. Marilena is the host of a national radio show in Italy dedicated to Italian African descendants. She also hosts a podcast featuring Italians of foreign origin speaking about racism, music, and topical issues. For over a decade, Deli has been speaking publicly about institutional racism within Italy and advocating for changes to the existing citizenship laws. Marilena, over to you.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you, Kombola. Thank you, Marina. Thank you, all these great speakers that are here today. It's beautiful and great to be here. And thank you to all the people who are listening to us tonight. So, as Kombola said, my name is Marilena Deli Umuoza, and I'm here today to talk about what it's like being a Black female photographer, filmmaker, and writer from one of the most conservative areas in Italy. I come from a small town in Italy, Bergamo. As I said, a very conservative area with strong anti-immigrants ideas. My father is Italian and my mother is Rwandan, a 3-time genocide survivor who basically passed from the racism of our country, fed by the former Belgian colonizers, to the racism of her husband's country, Italy. And I say racism because she was insulted verbally, physically, and worst of all, institutionally. She was once forbidden to vote, even if she had always voted since she became a citizen when she married my father. So she was forced to sue the city hall because of that. I grew up in a factory, living in different suburbs of Bergamo. Growing up there, I was called the N-word ever since I remember. And my very name, Umuhoza, who means counselor in Kinyarwanda, chosen from my Rwandan mother, was banned from my Italian ID because it was considered too ridiculous to end up on an Italian document. So I grew up without a representation, reading books or watching movies where Black people were depicted as bad. They would die first, or they would play cliché roles such as slaves, help, or prostitutes. Italian mass media depict the Black bodies following two narrations, desperation and criminality, and they are completely Black bodies are completely deprived of their dignity, objectified and dehumanized. So the truth is that Italy hasn't really dealt with its colonial past. The human zoos, the rapes, the use of illegal chemical weapons, the forced apartheid in the Horn of Africa. It is the only former colonial country in Europe that hasn't produced a critical consciousness about its responsibilities in Africa, with huge voids in the books that Italian students use at school. And because of that, Italian culture is pervaded by negative stereotypes that objectify and vilify the Black female body. Black women are hypersexualized and fetishized. Enrico De Seta, a famous cartoonist from the colonial era, would draw Abyssinian women completely naked. So being a Black Italian woman to me means having to deal with sexism like any other woman, racism from microaggressions to racist politics, and also Italy's colonial heritage. And when I talk about microaggressions, I refer to what Cameroonian thinker Achille Mbembe defines as Nano Racism, narcotic forms of prejudice that express themselves through jokes or sentences that are apparently innocent, but that in fact want to stigmatize and humiliate a human being. In my novel, Negretta Baci Razzisti, each chapter contains at least one episode of Nano Racism, like, oh, how good your Italian is, even after I explain that I was born and raised in Italy, or Italian is different than the African you speak that you know, including in the word African, the thousands of languages spoken in the whole continent, or to my father, you know, when I was a child, is your daughter adopted? 30 years later, they'd ask him if, they would ask him, is she your caregiver? Or again, people would ask me, what does your mom do? And so I would reply, she works in an American factory. So does she clean the stairs every time? No, she's an accountant because she can count too. So, as far as concern Italy's racist politics, the Mediterranean and the current genocide taking place under our own eyes represents one of Italy's faces of racism. These politics divide people into level A citizens and level B citizens. The truth is that there is not much difference between people who want to move to Italy and Italians who want to move abroad, maybe to find better opportunities. The difference is in the access to a document that allows them to travel legally and safe. So the peak of Italian racist politics, though, lays in the present citizenship law, jus sanguinis, the law of the blood, literally. It is impossible not to think about Mussolini's racial laws based on Italy's purity of blood, where Italy openly claimed to be a racist country. The present law discriminates against almost 1 million kids who were born and or raised in this country, who are 100% uncultured, who want to build a career and a family here, but have the fault of having immigrant parents. Because of that, they are forced to renew their permit of staying, feeling like strangers in their own country. They can go on a field trip, participate to important forming opportunities like Erasmus. They can do sport agonistically, and most of all, they are denied the right to vote. Italian racism is daily recorded by bodies like OSCAD, the Observatory for Security Against Acts of Discrimination, which states that 3 out of 4 discriminatory acts in Italy are racist, comes from racism. Let's take a moment now to remember some of the people who have died in Italy because of racism. Musa Balde, a migrant who suicided in a center for repatriation after being brutally assaulted in Turin, one of those centers where human rights are daily abused. Or Said Visin, a young soccer player of Milan, who suicided after repetitive complaints on the social network about people discriminating against him because of his color. Willy Duarte Monteiro, who was killed last year by a group of Italian men who assaulted him and literally split his heart in two. In 2018, Idi Diene was a Senegalese man who got shot by an Italian on the bridge of Florence 7 years after 2 other Senegalese men were killed for the same reason, racism. Somalia Sako was a farm worker from Mali who was collecting metal for his shack in the former slum of San Ferdinando in Calabria. Angelica mentioned him. He got shot with a rifle by an Italian man who claimed his own land using his words. And in 2016, Mohamed Abbassi from Tunisia was brutally tortured because he was behind with his rental payment. And if we take a look at the past 40 years, we can't forget Ali Jama, a Somalian man who in 1979 was burned alive under a bridge by 4 Italians who were discharged despite the 7 witnesses who assisted to the crime, or Giacomo Valente, a boy with Italian father and a Somalian mother, who in 1985 got stabbed 43 times by his classmates. And one above all, Jerry Essan Maslow, who in 1989 was killed by a racist raid and whose death marks the first revolt against illegal hiring, caporalato, and the birth of the Italian anti-racist movement. So that is why I decided to start filming, photographing, and writing to speak out about these racist politics and change the narration of Black people like me, like us. I wrote my first memoir, Razzismo all'italiana, cronache di una spia mezzo sangue, after reading that over 700 people died in the Mediterranean. I felt frustrated, angry, powerless. So I decided to write about my feelings and my family story with racism. The introduction is signed by Cécile Kyenge, Italy's first female parliamentarian, Black parliamentarian. Negretta Baci Razzisti is the follow-up to my memoir, one of the rarest Italian novels where the protagonist is an Italian Black woman, a positive role model and hopefully an inspiration to the next generations of Italians. This novel represents the shattered identity of a young woman who is Italian Rwandan like me, because memory is like a mirror, and it is hard to compose it in a chronological order. The only way to do that is by putting together its scattered fragments and dig into the characters through fresh flashbacks and flash forwards. That is how we get to know the 2 parents who are the key to recompose the main character's identity. A Rwandan mother who was kidnapped at age 5, like my mother, by the Belgians who tested the polio vaccine on children like her and who ended up contracting it. A mother who forces her daughter to use whitening soaps and straightening hair products to look more Italian. A mother who puts pressure on her daughter because she has to roll up her sleeves 10 times more in order to prove that she's not inferior to the white people. And then there is the father, a former missionary who gives up his priesthood to marry the first Black woman in his village. And because of that, he cuts his relationship with family and friends. A father who has strong anti-immigrant ideas, paradoxically, but who feels more African than Italian and never misses a chance to talk about his youth memories in Rwanda or Malawi. The protagonist of the novel is divided into, on one side, there is a girl who has all kinds of pressures from the society, the mother, the father. On the other side, there is a girl who just wants to be a girl like everybody else, and rise above her skin color. So as far as concerned, my work as a filmmaker and photographer, I decided to do that because I wanted to return to my African roots and provide a more representation to the music world. I first went to Rwanda in 2009 to record with Grammy-winning producer Ian Brennan, a documentary on my mother's return to Rwanda after 30 years being apart. It's called the Rwanda Mama. And then we found The Good Ones, an extraordinary trio embodying the three Rwandan tribes, Hutu, Tutsi, and Kwa. For the past 12 years, I have traveled with Ian to 13 African nations, and our records have resulted in original music being widely released in 25 languages across 37 albums, with 3 more planned for next year. And these records have led to 24 artists being able to leave their countries for the first time ever, including many elderly individuals. Our work have received a Grammy in 2012 for the record Tassili by Tina Riwen, and the Grammy nomination in 2016 for the record Zomba Prison Project, which also won an Emmy after being featured in a segment of the US TV show 60 Minutes with CNN anchorman Anderson Cooper. As we have done with those targeted for albinism on Ukerewe Island, a genocide survivor in my mother's country, Rwanda, or Cambodia, and prisoners at a Zomba prison in Malawi, our objective is to provide a platform to those otherwise censored or unheard. And these are not for-profit labors of love. So it's been a humbling experience to me, and touring with so many artists has been mind-blowing. The funny thing is that people would often think I was one of the band. It happened many times. Once in New Zealand, people would stop me and ask me for autographs, believing I was some major Brazilian singer at the time, because we were both Black and I had the same throw, when in fact she was at least 10 years older than me at the time, and we didn't look alike at all. Sometimes these kind of microaggressions would be harsher and unexpected, like when we met with some Belgian music producer who told us that in Rwanda, my mother's country, there is no good music. Or when we suggested a band from Malawi to participate to a music festival, but we were told, no, we already covered Malawi. Or even when the Mumford and Sons asked us to bring the good ones from Rwanda to America so that they could jam together without thinking it would mean buying a ticket, paying for visa expenses, and multiple rejections of that visa, plus dealing with the difficult system of transportation and communication we have to go through in order to reach them. So the truth is that there is a lack of diversity in pop culture internationally, despite the internet creating the illusion of meritocracy and inclusiveness. Over 75% of the commercial music distributed is controlled by just 3 major corporations. Over 100,000 albums are released annually in America, and more than 40,000 songs are uploaded to Spotify daily. Yet the vast majority of the world misses hearing this music, as 90% of streaming activity is concentrated in the elite 1% superstar personalities. So nearly 80% of African nations have never had a single artist even nominated for a Grammy. In the 60 years of history of the Grammys, 2/3 of the nominations in the world music category come from the same 6 countries: US, Brazil, UK, Mali, South Africa, and India, which proves how disconnected we really are in this world beyond our Western comfort. So I would like to quickly show you, if there is time, Kombola, just let me know. Okay, just a few photos from my work as a photographer. So I will now share the screen. All right. So this is an artist from Rwanda, and she has on her head an agaseke, which is a typical basket handmade in Rwanda, my mother's country. This is, a great singer from Comore Islands, and our record just came out. This is a group of girls, Afari girls from Djibouti. This is a woman, I cannot tell you the name because it's from Ghana. The record is called Witch Camp Ghana. This is an artist from Salento, and this is his tattoo. This is Janvier from the trio I was telling you about, the good ones from Rwanda. This is a woman singing in the prison of Zomba in Malawi. This is Momina from Djibouti, and you see actually the covers of two books. To the right, there is the book I was telling you about, my last novel, and the other one is one of the three books actually on our trips that Ian and I have done our journey, musical journey in underrepresented countries. But you can find more on my website, www.marilenadelli.com. Then here is a great singer from Transylvania. Her name is Paola Turcas from the band Smitri. This is Adrienne from the trio The Good Ones, and we were recording in his hut near Kigali. This is Momina again in Djibouti, and this is another great singer from the record Tanzania Albinism Collective. This is an artist from Tuva. Her name is Sainko. And finally, this is another artist from our Vietnam record. So you can find more of our work on my website, but now I'm done. And so thank you so much, everyone, for your time.
Thank you, Marilena. Thank you for sharing this. It was very, very...
My pleasure.
And stimulating. I remember that I remind all the attendees that if they have questions for Angelica, Natasha, and Marilena, they can send it through the Q&A feature. Our fourth speaker today is Oisa Queensday Obazui. Oisa areas of expertise is in human rights and migration. She completed a master's degree in international relations at the University of Macerata. She has written articles and essays for the Vision Internazionale and Jacobin Italia. In 2020, she published the book Corpi Estranei, in which she deconstructs systemic racism in Italy. She is currently a junior researcher and program assistant for CYD, Italian Coalition for Freedom and Civil Rights. Here she deals with migration, anti-discrimination, migrant rights in administrative detention and inclusion. Her paper today is entitled Systemic Racism in Italy. Oisa, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's a pleasure. And let me quickly share my screen with you. All right. I hope you can see it. So this is my presentation, and Corpi Estranei indeed is the title, il titolo del mio libro, of my book. So in this book, I obviously deconstruct systemic racism in Italy, which can be divided, according to me, into three different categories. So we have institutional racism, historical and cultural racism, and non-racist peoples in quote racism. Because why? Of course, racism is not a single event. As Achille Mbembe said in this interview to Quartier Général, he said, le racisme existe, il n'est pas un accident, mais un écosystème. So racism is not a single event, it's a system, it's constituted by a system. And in Italy, we can divide it into three different sections. So we have institutional racism, which is pretty much constituted by restrictive immigration law, exploitation of migrant men and women workers, the question of citizenship reform, and administrative detention of migrants. We have different kind of institutional racism. Then we have historical and cultural racism, which is the fact that Italian colonialism is still perceived as an adventure, that Italians were not so bad after all, and we still have a representation of racist representation that have not been, we can say, decolonized, because
because after, I mean, the colonial concept is still present, especially in the representation of Black bodies in Italian media. And then we have the racism of the so-called non-racist people, or the people that describe themselves as non-racist, but they actually are, because they perpetuate as sort of white citierism or voluntarism, when we see especially white people, white Western people that go to poor villages and take pictures and with, I don't know, maybe Black children and put it on the Instagram. So we have different, and the same thing happened in Italy, especially with the conception that they have of Black bodies and African people in general, but we will see that later. So I'll just briefly start with institutional racism and sorry, I'm going, okay. All right. Very quickly, of course, when we talk about institutional racism, we of course have to point out the situation concerning migration and human rights. So this is what I obviously often write about, and this is basically what I'm doing with the NGO I work with, and I work on the human rights of migrants and foreign people in general living in Italy. In this case, we have a problem concerning, for example, inequalities in international mobility, because even if Italy is one of the main countries in the European Union that receive the highest number of migrants, and the problem is that the question of migration is not tackled properly, because it's always seen as something that is an emergency, basically. But the problem is that the approach that Italy and the European Union have towards migration. So, for example, visa applications are often rejected if they come from countries from, for example, Western Africa or African countries in general, because as we know, if you have an African passport, maybe a Sudanese or Nigerian or Ghanaian passport, it is not the same thing as having a French passport or Italian passport, with which of course you can go anywhere. But if you come from an African country, it is not the same thing, and the person is forced, therefore, maybe to travel through dangerous ways and to ask for asylum. But we know that according to international law, you are granted asylum basically only if you flee from a situation of persecution. So what if I come from Nigeria and I just want to look for a better job? I apply for a visa, the visa rejected. What am I supposed to do? That maybe I get on a boat and I try to reach Italy, but at the same time I get pushed back, which is again something illegal and goes against international law. But as we can see in this map here, the problem is that if me coming from, for example, a so-called developing country, I do not have the means to, I do not have the way to travel abroad, what am I supposed to do? This map is very clear. It shows that if you have a Western passport, you can go anywhere. But if you have a passport and you come from, I don't know, maybe India or Sudan, you can not go anywhere basically without a visa. And this is because of racist policies that characterize Europe, the internal policies that needs to be changed. And it's something that it is not understood at the Italian and European level. Italy is also one of the main countries that has the so-called memorandum d'intesa, so memorandum of understanding with Libya. So we literally pay the Libyan militias to push migrants back, and this is against international law. And the entire European Union knows about this, but they do not care, and they keep financing third countries in which human rights are not protected, and of course migrants are being deprived of their human rights. So in Italy, we have this problem, the so-called laws concerning migration. And in this case, I just briefly want to talk about the so-called Bossi-Fini law, because let's say that a migrant coming from an African country makes it and arrives to Italy. We have in this case, we have very restrictive laws that welcomes these migrants, because in this case, we have the Bossi-Fini law, which binds the residence permit to the employment contract, making it difficult, if not possible, for a foreign person to stay in Italy. Because of course, the paradox here is that the person coming from Africa, in this case, which can be Nigeria, Ghana, whatever, is supposed to have a contract before coming to Italy, but the employer in Italy doesn't even know this person. So how am I supposed to have a contract if I'm still living in the country of origin? So this is a paradox. And of course, this law was made to reduce migration flows. But the problem is that this law keeps migrant women and men, migrant workers, women and men in a condition of exploitation, threats, abuses, because the employers, Italian employers, know that without working, that person cannot have that specific document. And of course, it is in the interest of the employer to keep that person in an irregular situation, even if they try to regularize themselves. In this case, we have the Coordinamento Migranti di Bologna, which is very important in the anti-racism aspect, because there is a coordination made of migrant women and men that work for their own rights and in obtaining especially an unconditional and European residence permit free from stringent requirements of employment, contract, and income that of course often lead the person to accept inhuman and degrading conditions. So here is a picture of migrants in Italy that have been protesting for so many years now, but the government doesn't listen to. And of course, we have the Repatriation Center for Migration, that are the centers in which basically, if you are found without a residence permit, police basically brings you and puts you in a repatriation center. And in this case, no human rights is respected, no healthcare. There have been beatings by the police officers towards these migrants, and which basically have not committed any crime. They just have been found without the proper document. And this is against human rights, against human rights, but the government is not doing anything to overcome the situation. And of course, we have the question of citizenship, as even Marilena said before. I just want to go very fast in this because it's a very complicated issue, but it is a matter of blood, in fact, because we have the ius sanguinis. A person can become Italian only if one of their parents basically is Italian, or if they adopted, of course, or if they marry an Italian person. But the problem is that it's the blood that is the real issue here. So if you were born here by foreign parents, but even if you were raised or born here and you live your entire life here in Italy, you're still not considered to be Italian. And this is another paradox in this country, which does not recognize its own citizens. And even if they tried to do a reform in 2017, the reform didn't get enough votes. Here you can see the reform that was proposed to the parliament, but it didn't get enough votes. So as far as historical racism is concerned, of course, when we talk about Italian colonialism, we have the so-called Italiani brava gente type of idea. So Italians were good after all, because they weren't as bad as the French, as the British that colonized maybe Senegal or Nigeria. So Italians were good after all because they built roads, etc. But instead, they were we were talking about a dictatorship, which was the fascism period. We're talking about
is that just blocked? Let's see.
Can you hear me?
For a while, for a minute, something.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, now.
Okay, so I was trying to say that the Italiani brava gente concept is not actually true, of course, because we can remember about the two facts concerning the massacre in Addis Ababa, and of course the asphyxiating gas against civilians that were used against North African people. And of course, these are some drawings of the way African people, especially women, were depicted. So Black women were perceived to be prostitutes, were conceived to be sexual beings, basically ready to satisfy the white man, the white colonizer. So this was the perception that, unfortunately, we still have towards Black women, especially when certain white men try to flirt with us in Italy. So we still have this kind of problem. And here I wanted also to show the way that we still have stereotypes. We had stereotypes and we still have stereotypes in the representation of Black people in the media. So in this case, we have a picture of Totò, which is an important Italian actor that painted themselves as Black. So the Black face is something that was done in Italy. And unfortunately, it is still done today, because we do have shows like Tale Quale Show, this one, in which basically Black Italians paint themselves as Black to interpret Black actors, singers. And even if many people, especially Black Italian people, sent letters to the producers of the show saying, hey, this is offensive, you cannot do this, it is racist. The producers do not care about Black Italians watching this, and they keep doing it. So we can see how these things are not perceived to be as racist in Italy. So that is why even talking about racism in Italy is very hard, because basically they do not listen to you. And before going this, before showing you that video briefly, I just wanted to tell you that even today, it is hard for Black actors not to interpret roles that are stereotyped, basically. And that's why I want to show you in this video that it's very hard for a Black actor or actress to interpret something that is not a stereotype.
We cannot hear it very well.
You cannot hear it?
Not very well.
Sorry, can you hear it? No?
No.
Non capisco se mi sentite.
No.
There are subtitles. I think we can read, right?
Yeah, so it's not a big problem.
Can you hear it now?
Terrorista arabo,
Yeah.
tappeti.
La mamma di qualcuno africano, brasiliano.
L'immigrato clandestino.
Per esempio una disgraziata nullatenente, analfabeta e ignorante.
I'm sorry, it's just because I had microphone, that's why you couldn't hear it before. So, and finally, the problem here is that this is something that we already talked about, but briefly, even in Italy, we still have the concept of the so-called voluntarism, white civilian complex. And when we talk about migration, when we talk about Africa and Africans, even if this concept doesn't come from a person that is racist, meaning that far-right racist, they can still perpetuate racist kind of behavior. So the white person that goes to a poor village in the specific country of Africa and takes pictures, and of course treats that specific child, for example, as an object to put in the background of their picture. And of course, this is a behavior that needs to be stopped, because this is a tendency to show oneself as a savior of Africans in need. And Africans are always poor and sad, even if there are, of course, situations of poverty and instability. That is not the complete representation of an entire continent with 54 countries. So of course, even this is a racist representation of Africa and Africans. And also, this is the so-called performative anti-racism. On the left, there is a little drawing of Zero Calcare, which is an important also activist and disegnatore, fumettista in Italian, that talks about social issues. And of course, I wanted to talk about performative anti-racism, which is still a form of racism because it comes from the so-called non-racist people. But if there is, if there are the people that the minorities that want to speak, okay, there is this white person that takes the microphone and say, hey, I can speak for you, but that's not anti-racism. That's the way that usually, even here in Italy, we do still have problems in speaking about the correct type of anti-racism that we're supposed to do. But white people usually do not listen to us, even if they want to be, even if they want to help, they are like, okay, I can speak for you. They take your microphone and they not allow you to speak for yourself. This is another problem that, again, is racist, even if the person that perceives themselves as anti-racist is not aware of the damage that they are doing. And so as Ijoma Oloa said, this is an article of the Guardian, if your anti-racism work prioritizes the growth and enlightenment of white America, this speaks about, of course, the white people in America, but it's something that to me can be applied to everywhere, especially Western world, white Western world, over the dignity and humanity of people of color. It is not anti-racism work, it's white supremacy. So if you still, so if you want to talk about racism and anti-racism just to glorify yourself and say, oh, I'm a white person, I'm the savior of the minorities, you're still perpetuating racism because you're not allowing them to speak for themselves. So this is something that, of course, needs to be stopped, and we need to actually do something to, again, to stop this. kind of behavior. And so just to wrap this up, the definition of racism, therefore, is not monolithic, and the dictionary definition alone is not enough, because maybe we have a very short definition of racism in the dictionary. But as we know, as I tried to show you, it's not immediately recognizable, and it can be in different kind of groups, in different kinds of situations. So institutional, we have cultural, historical, and of course, the so-called non-racist people's racism, that it's even harder to understand. And yeah, so I'm done. I tried to be very, very fast because this presentation was quite long, but
thank you. Well, thank you, Oisa.
Okay.
Our first speaker, before if you have questions for our speakers, you can send them through the Q&A feature. Our fifth speaker is Jara Khan. Jara is a writer, journalist, and activist. She grew up in Caserta, and since an early age, she became interested in writing as means of expression and resistance in a challenging community deeply marked by the racial tension between Italian residents and the African community. In this context of segregation, she co-created the blog Casava Call, which allowed her to extensively write about Castelvolturno, a seaside town with a complex past. She participated in the Women Creative Mentorship Project and in the International Writing Program funded by the University of Iowa. In 2020, she published the collection of short stories entitled Ladri di Denti. She also writes for various magazines, including the weekly Italian magazine L'Espresso. Jara, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, and hi to everyone. If it's not a problem for you all, I would like to speak in Italian. I guess I'll be the only one.
Yes, I think you can.
Ok. Buonasera a tutti. Sono felicissima di partecipare a questo evento e soprattutto felicissima di poter condividere con voi quello che, in maniera ovviamente breve, quello che un po' è stato il mio rapporto con la scrittura e con il razzismo. A volte si ha come la sensazione che il razzismo sia l'unica cosa che ci resti tra le mani, no? Un argomento che pervade così tanto le nostre esistenze da lasciarci alcune volte senza alcune parole. E questa è stata la sensazione che ho sempre vissuto in un certo senso. Ci sono stati dei momenti in cui ho cercato, ecco, di liberarmi da questa grande balena, no? Io la chiamo la balena e tutti quanti noi in un certo senso, in quante persone nere ci ritroviamo attualmente nella pancia della balena. Però a un certo punto ho capito che si poteva raccontare il razzismo anche da altri punti di vista che non fossero strettamente di natura analitica e politica, ma di natura esistenziale. A me il razzismo fondamentalmente mi ha aiutato a capire un po' questo, a capire come funzionavano realmente le cose. Ovviamente il razzismo è un sistema di potere, su questo siamo tutti quanti d'accordo, che contribuiamo tutti in un modo o nell'altro a tenere vivo. E nella mia scrittura ovviamente io analizzo questa cosa perché mi sono sempre chiesta quale fosse il punto, no, di tutta quanta questa sofferenza, quale fosse il punto di queste cosiddette disuguaglianze, di quelle che si chiamano disuguaglianze, ma che alla fine sono un qualcosa che va molto più nel profondo, perché poi alla fine ecco, le parole a furia di essere usate come se perdessero della consistenza. Allora attraverso la letteratura ho cercato di dare un po' una consistenza più tridimensionale a quelle che erano parole che oramai si è abituati ad ascoltare così tanto fino allo sfinimento. Ho scritto questo libro, Ladri di Denti, partendo proprio dal titolo. Spesso mi viene chiesto che cosa significhi per me questa frase, ecco, Ladri di Denti. E ogni volta che mi veniva chiesto il significato del mio libro avevo sempre un po' delle difficoltà a cercare di spiegarmi. Poi ho capito che cosa volevo veramente intendere con questo libro e con questo titolo. Alla fine i denti sono quella cosa che ci permette comunque di sopravvivere, di esprimerci, di raccontare di noi stessi. Più in particolare la bocca, ecco, lo strumento della bocca che ci permette questo, l'oralità. E allora per me che cosa ha rappresentato il vivere in un sistema che non mi permetteva di esprimermi? È stato appunto il furto continuo della parola, il furto continuo del suono, il furto continuo di storie che poi alla fine svanivano nel nulla. Essendo cresciuta a Castelvolturno, io ho sviluppato come una sorta di ossessione, no, per le storie, perché essere immigrati, io non lo sono ovviamente, ma in Italia è un po' particolare questa cosa, perché puoi essere un'immigrata senza aver mai emigrato. E in un certo senso quello che è lo status giuridico dei tuoi genitori ti viene trasmesso attraverso il sangue. Ed è già da qui che si capisce quanto formalmente si dice che le razze non esistono, ma poi la prima forma di razzismo che ci viene restituita viene perpetrata attraverso la burocrazia, attraverso quella che è il significato stesso della politica, del fare politica e dell'essere comunità. Quindi queste storie, ecco, che mi passavano davanti erano sempre delle storie che comunque non rimanevano, perché nella mia comunità, per esempio, gli immigrati andavano e venivano, o per esempio sparivano totalmente. Sparivano e non rimaneva alcuna traccia comunque di quella che era la loro vita. E questa cosa mi provocava sempre moltissima sofferenza, ma effettivamente questa mancanza di potersi radicare ad un luogo è proprio il destino biologico delle persone immigrate, degli stranieri in questo paese, l'impossibilità di mettere radici. Fin da quando vieni al mondo, oppure raggiungi, no, l'Italia, abbandonando quello che è la tua casa, fai un tentativo comunque di mettere radici, che ciò nonostante viene sempre ostacolato continuamente dal razzismo. Quindi ho cominciato a raccogliere queste storie, a cercare di scriverle, di non dimenticarle, perché per me erano un'eredità che era preziosa, anche se non valeva per i bianchi, per tutti coloro che comunque non facevano parte della comunità. Per me era importante che queste persone che sparivano una continuazione, che venivano deportate, oppure che semplicemente morivano senza fare alcun rumore, venissero ricordate. E credo che sia questa la ragione che mi ha avvicinata alla letteratura. Io nel mio libro, in Ladri di denti, che è la mia prima raccolta, non ho parlato specificatamente di tutte quante queste storie. Più che altro il lavoro che ho fatto al suo interno è stato un lavoro che andava a scavare molto, anche attraverso la fantasia, in tutta una serie di quesiti che giorno dopo giorno mi tormentano in un certo senso, perché poi è così. E la scrittura, la letteratura mi danno la possibilità di trovare una spiegazione a volte, no? Perché io sono ossessionata dalle domande, ma anche dalle risposte, no? Uno cresce e dice, vabbè, tu sei nero, tu sei bianco, tu sei così, così, così. E sembra che tutti quanti accettino questa cosa. Però per me non stanno così le cose, come non stanno così le cose per tantissime persone che lottano oppure che raccontano il razzismo attraverso tutti quanti gli strumenti che l'arte e l'espressione umana mette a disposizione dell'essere umano. E tutti quanti noi cerchiamo delle risposte e tutti quanti noi, dal momento in cui cerchiamo queste risposte a tutta questa brutalità, a questa disuguaglianza, in un modo o nell'altro riusciamo a creare arte. Riusciamo a trarre comunque da questa sofferenza quella che è l'arte, la capacità di risignificarsi, la capacità di ritrovare una posizione all'interno di un sistema che una posizione non te la dà, o meglio te la dà, ma non è la posizione che tu vorresti avere, ecco. Noi viviamo in una condizione di scomodità. Io perlomeno attraverso la letteratura non dico che ho questo sogno comunque di stare comoda, perché nella vita è impossibile. Sono femmina e sono nera e quindi non si può stare comodi. Però sicuramente si può andare a fondo, molto a fondo nelle cose e si possono cercare ovviamente delle nuove forme di espressione. Si può cercare anche di sfidare quella che è la lingua, no? La grande sfida della lingua. Oggi parliamo moltissimo, no, di linguaggio, di inclusività, della possibilità di di poter stare tutti in quanti insieme in uno spazio. E la maggior parte delle proteste che ovviamente vengono da un mondo razzista, spesso dicono che non c'è tutto questo bisogno di darsi delle etichette, di darsi dei nomi, perché le differenze non fanno altro che aumentare le diseguaglianze. Ma questo sistema in cui viviamo, il sistema patriarcale, bianco e capitalista, è un sistema che non potrebbe vivere se non ci fossero queste diseguaglianze, non potrebbe assolutamente sopravvivere. Quindi il compito di chi vive in una maniera conscia la propria vita all'interno di questa società è quello di sforzarsi per nominare ogni singola cosa e se ci riesce rinominarla. Noi siamo qui oggi a cercare di, ecco, rinominare tutta una serie di concetti, tutta una serie di spazi. Vogliamo dare nuovi nomi e secondo me nuovi nomi non significa solamente, cioè trovare dei nuovi nomi non significa solamente decolonizzare, ma anche colonizzare nuovi spazi, perché io voglio colonizzare. Io a un certo punto voglio essere, voglio dire una cosa un po' controcorrente, voglio dire che io voglio colonizzare perché questo spazio mi è stato tolto e io voglio colonizzarlo con dei valori diversi, con dei valori che non escludano le persone, non le ammazzino, lo vogliamo fare tutti quanti. Quindi, insomma, per me la mia, tra virgolette, battaglia, ma non è neanche una battaglia, è proprio un modo di vivere l'esistenza, si fonda soprattutto sulla parola, sulla capacità e sulla forza e sul coraggio di stare scomodi, ma comunque trovando uno spazio che ti permetta di lottare. Tra le tante cose io mi trovo anche un po' in una situazione, come posso dire, anche di difficoltà alcune volte quando si parla di queste tematiche, perché nel mio piccolo comunque io mi sento una persona privilegiata. Riesco a parlare la lingua, a padroneggiare la lingua, a capire, sono cresciuta nella pancia della balena e quindi certe cose le so, a certe cose ci arrivo. Ma se penso alle persone ormai anziane, no, che fanno parte della mia comunità, perché si vedono gli immigrati vengono sempre, per esempio, immigrati africani immaginati come giovani e forti appena arrivati, ma ci sono delle persone che vivono in questo paese da 30, da 40 anni e queste persone qua che fine fanno? Dove vanno a finire? Io ci penso ai miei vecchi, io ci penso comunque a tutte queste persone. Io penso sia a quelli che stanno in questo paese da 30 anni che a quelli che stanno arrivando adesso. E in entrambi i casi comunque sono persone che non avranno questa possibilità di poter in qualche maniera sfidare quello che è il sistema, perché la condizione sociale ed economica non glielo consente. Allora io voglio sfruttare questa fortuna che ho avuto di poter studiare almeno un minimo e di poter utilizzare l'italiano per combattere, per riscrivere tutta una serie di concetti e per avere almeno una possibilità minima di non dimenticare. Ecco, non ci dimentichiamo.
Grazie Zara, grazie mille. È stato veramente molto interessante e mi piace moltissimo l'idea di scomodità e di lottare contro questo concetto. We don't have much time, so before officially opening the Q&A session, I would like to invite Professor Loredana Polezzi to make a comment. I know that most of you know Loredana. Professor Polezzi is Alphonse M. D'Amato Endowed Chair in Italian American and Italian Studies at Stony Brook University, and her work concentrates on multiple forms of mobility, their history, their representation, and theorization. A recent work focuses on diasporic Italian cultures and on multilingual education in Europe and Sub-Saharan Africa. Loredana, over to you.
Kamala, thank you, grazie, and let me say first of all how much I have learned and I am learning. It's so valuable being here. I don't even think that saying it's a pleasure is the right word. It is a pleasure, but it's also it's most of all incredibly valuable. And thank you for asking me to comment. I should say something first of all about my own positioning and about the fact that I don't mean in any way, and I don't think that I could in any way provide any answers, but I think I can reiterate or pose some more questions. I am speaking to you from Long Island, so I should say, talking of stolen land and stolen voices, I should say that I am speaking from the stolen lands of the Setalka people, Wopawak, also known as Stony Brook. I also want to somehow pick up on the three words that are in the title of today's event, as I offer some comments on what I listened to. And those are activism and anti-racism and citizenship. So for me, as a white woman, as a woman who has studied colonialism, who has studied and studies migration, who is engaged constantly in conversations, and also as someone who carries at present the title of an endowed chair, which is named after a conservative politician, actually, here in the US. One of the key questions in listening and engaging in active listening is, how do we as activists create spaces for conversations, and spaces for conversations which are both equitable and also reciprocal? That word reciprocity is a word that came up this morning. It came up in Natasha's talk, but was also clearly either explicitly or implicitly sort of present in pretty much all of the conversations. And I was thinking also about how the reciprocity is not only reciprocity of language, reciprocity in linguistic exchange, as Natasha was saying, but it's also a reciprocity of memory. If we don't have a reciprocity of memory, if we don't have voices that speak about the memories that we carry with ourselves, then the reciprocity even of the immediate exchange, I think, becomes problematic. So for me, that question of reciprocity is at the center of things. And also, of course, the question of language. I absolutely loved, and I'm going to take away with me what Giada just said about sfidare la lingua and also la sfida della lingua. You know, how do we defy the language that we carry with us and at the same time somehow meet that engagement? The language that we carry with us already embeds so many of these stereotypes and prejudices and set systems of vision, which are also systems of power, as we know. Gaze always carries with itself a directionality and a potential, at least, for exercises of power. So I think that question, again, of reciprocity comes up there. And then the question of empathy. I was recent at another event, I think, Mola, you may have been there, the Leuven event on migration. And one of the colleagues there, Alexandra, was saying, yes, but empathy is not enough. Well, certainly empathy in the sense of sentimentality, which actually in the way that we were talking about this morning is closer to the politics of pity than it is to the politics of solidarity and of engagement. So we need not just, we need to feel, but then we need to go beyond feeling. We need epistemologies and we need politics and practices which allow us to somehow translate that shared feeling into a set of shared practices. And that's where things get complicated. They get complicated in terms of that other word that is in the title, the question of citizenship. I was saying earlier, we have later on this week an event at which Kumbola will be speaking on citizenship today in the broader diasporic Italian context. And I was talking yesterday to a colleague, to Teresa Fiore, whose family is a family which is at both times an immigrant and an emigrant family. So even that divide doesn't work there any longer. And we were asking so many questions precisely about this idea of the jus sanguinis. The jus sanguinis, it's another of these metaphors, you know, blood, as it's one of these naturalizing metaphors that somehow want to tell us that there is something that is simply natural, that is not constructive, that is not cultural, that is not political, and that we can sort of return to. And I think we need to seriously fight against all of these metaphors. And the other one for me that is very much a couple to that is the question of the mother tongue. You know, if we have multiple citizenships, we have multiple allegiances, and we also have multiple languages, so many of us, and we need to think about that. And then besides, I want to finish on that other central term of the question of anti-racism. It's actually from Angelica and from a number of other colleagues, from Kumbola, from Essays, Maid, and from others, that I've learned to think more carefully. Because yes, you know, I think for a while, I certainly belonged in that category of people who said, I don't want to talk about, well, I don't want to talk about race. No, I'm talking about race all the time, but I don't want to reify race. I don't want it as a category that exists, again, as a natural category, in the same way in which I don't want to talk about jus sanguinis as a natural category. I don't want to talk about mother tongue as a natural category. But I do absolutely want to talk about race and racialization and what comes with that, and racism in terms of the constructed historical experience that is part of these spaces, public spaces, as Angelica was saying at the beginning, and also private spaces that are intimate spaces that we carry with us. So I don't have answers, but I share those questions, and I share the notion of activism. For me, it comes especially in the form of language activism, of constantly reminding people that we have multiple linguistic allegiances, and that often, in fact, language comes in and stands for, as a proxy for things that people don't want to talk about. So often language, for instance, stands in precisely for race, stands in for religion, stands in for other areas where we reify and vilify diversity. And I would like to hear more. I would like to hear more on these topics and on how, as activists, we create these spaces. I don't know if I want to colonize them, but I certainly want to occupy them. You know, I would like us to occupy these spaces to create more equitable conversations. And I'll stop there. I know you've got questions in the Q&A, and I'm sure there will be more as we go along. Thank you.
Thank you, Loredana. Thank you very much. As I said, we don't have much time, so I will now hand over to Dr. Morani, who will moderate the Q&A session. I want to thank all the speakers. It was extremely interesting and fascinating, and I really learned a lot. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kumbola, and yeah, a big thank you to our speakers who delivered 5 fantastic and thought-provoking papers. And to Professor Loredana Poletti, thank you for the great commentary and very interesting reflections. But yeah, I don't want to take up too much time because we've only got 10-15 minutes for questions, and some really great questions have come through already. And I know that some of you have already answered a few of those. So I'm gonna try to make it as one question per speaker, or trying to, but we can also be flexible and have a more of a general conversations open to all the 5 speakers. So early in our session, a couple of questions came through for from Stefano Piemontese for Dr. Angelica Pesarini. I think Stefano wanted to know a bit more about Angelica Pesarini's extensive work on the Roma communities. So I don't know, Angelica, if you would like to say something about this, and in particular about the experience of Blackness in Europe through the observation of other Black Europeans, the Roma, according to Stefano. Not a precise question, but something that Stefano would like to hear more, some reflections about who are the Roma for Black Europeans and intersectional alliances possible. So maybe this is not something you touched on today, but I don't know if you wanted to say something about this.
Yes, thank you. Actually, this is part of a previous work I've done, and so I can quickly mention it. And then if Stefano want to message me privately, I can carry on, because I think it would be important to discuss what we have talked about today. I started to work on the Roma communities when I was still at university in Rome. I work on women and the gender and economic gender identities and economic activities. And I did this at a time when I didn't know what was gender studies and what was Black studies, because I was still in Italy, and I knew I had an interest on that kind of issues, but I didn't know to name it using language. I didn't know there was a sort of disciplinary field that could help me to better investigate this issue. And so it's just when I moved abroad that I started to name some of the issues I was interested in. I think the Roma communities definitely help us to understand even better the complexities between race and color, and how these categories are parallel but also a bit distinct, and how race and gender and class, amongst other things, are really so strictly intertwined that we cannot really talk about one without mentioning the other. And the Roma communities is really help us to reflect on that. I think probably race and color is useful here, because it's not just about color, right? It's not the amount of melanin we carry on our skin, is the meaning that has been attributed to certain features that we carry on our body. So Loredana mentioned racialization. I think racialization is probably the key point here. We know that race has been invented to support racism, and racializations help us to understand that this is a process, is an ongoing process. So it fluctuates and evolved in different ways. So we are all racialized, right? Yeah. Even if we see at the screen, each of us is racialized in a different way, but it's important to know the history of that racialization and of those processes. And so the Roma clearly have a very specific and unique history also in Europe. Not every Roma group is phenotypically non-white. Many Romas are actually white, but are socially Black. And so this is helpful, I think, to understand this difference, how class is also one of the factors that make us Black. So the poorer we are, the Blacker we are. And this is interesting also if we think about Italians and Irish, when, for example, they went to the US, right? Irish, whiter than Irish, I mean, is pretty white, and they were called Black. How is that possible? And I think it's really this. And so with the Roma, I investigated what Roma women in the streets of Rome were doing. What does it mean to beg in the streets with children? To do that, I conducted a longitudinal ethnographic fieldwork of 1 year. I went to Roma camps. Sometimes I lived there for a bit, and I conducted interviews and shared pieces of life with some Roma women. And I can put the reference of this study in the chat if someone is interested.
Thank you very much, Angelica. You had a second question, but I would extend it to everyone, really, because it's an interesting question about the mansplaining comments that each of you might receive on your work, whether it's an academic article, like as Angelica was telling us, but also I would say white-splaining as well as mansplaining, really. Or yes, to your work, whether it's artistic work or academic work. So the question was, yes, how do you respond to this type of patronizing and really, yes, mansplaining or white-splaining type of attitudes towards anti-racist cultural work. I would ask it to briefly, maybe Angelica, then Marilena, and Jara as well.
Yeah, I think as I mentioned earlier, I use that as data. So I use the insults and the patronizing comments as data to understand where that was coming from. So on a personal level, I'm a human being, so obviously reading certain things doesn't make me happy, but at the same time, I also try to, Katarina was asking, how do we protect ourselves from this hatred we may experience online? And so in my case, in this case, I tried with my colleague, we both received a lot of comments of hatred. We just distanced ourselves and we used the words, so the language that Jara was beautifully mentioning, la sfida della lingua. We use the lingua to our own advantage. So we use that language and we transform that language into knowledge and into data that can be used to maybe change mentality.
Thank you.
Can you repeat the question, Marina? Please.
Yes, so the question was about mansplaining or white-splaining comments that
Can you ask me the question in Italian? I'm sorry.
Sì,
I'm not following.
così la domanda è anche per Giara o per tutte.
Grazie.
La domanda in riferimento all'articolo di Angelica che ha ricevuto sul caso Montanelli e Colston, che ha ricevuto commenti, diciamo,
anche negativi.
Sì. Adesso in italiano faccio.
Scusami, magari Angelica mi spieghi?
Sì, la domanda è praticamente come ci difendiamo, come ci proteggiamo dai commenti di odio o di razzismo che riceviamo online.
Ok, grazie mille. I'm sorry I had to ask you to repeat the question.
If you want to answer in Italian, that's perfect.
No, well, I read the article and it was very inspiring, and everything Angelica writes, it's very inspiring, really. In fact, I interviewed her in both my radio shows to talk about that too. There was a question, for example, specifically about how, for example, my novel, Negretta Baci Razzisti, was received. And I replied, it was received well, especially from the Black community, Italian community, but my publisher, based in Rome, received a lot of negative emails, also vulgar. So the way I react to that is to just continue writing and doing what I'm doing. Through my writing, I basically convey my ideas that are also very political, and in every possible way, through music, for example, with the records that I co-produce with Ian, or through my radio shows. I try to, I don't know, humbly, in a humble way, to provide a platform to people that are very talented and who aren't heard, and who really need, not deserve, who need to be listened to, because they're great voices. And unfortunately, we are in a world where the average person working in media is middle-aged, is white, is a straight man, and it's time to change things because Italy is changing, and so to me it's very important to provide a platform to, like you're doing tonight, to these amazing voices, to these great writers and thinkers that really need, and I underline, not deserve, who need to be heard.
Ok, grazie Marilena. Allora
Prego.
provo,
Grazie
provo a
Marina.
essere più chiara. Adesso volevo anche coinvolgere Giara con questa domanda, o più in generale, appunto, visto che c'è stata anche un'altra domanda su questo, sulla ricezione del vostro lavoro culturale, attivismo culturale. Nel tuo caso, Giara, appunto, la sperimentazione con, oltre al tuo lavoro anche giornalistico, ma anche di fiction, quindi sia magari se ci vuoi dire qualcosa di più sulla ricezione del tuo lavoro, sulla divulgazione, eventualmente anche la gestione, la tua protezione verso commenti e problematici, negativi, e così, insomma, qualcosa su questo aspetto.
Buonasera, buonasera Marina, non ti preoccupare, si capiva tutto, tranquilla. Allora, sì, io ho sempre in mente questo commento che non potrò mai dimenticare, è un commento lasciato, cioè una recensione insomma, in cui il mio libro viene definito come l'ennesima lamentela delle nere che provano a farsi una carriera con il razzismo. E questa è una cosa che ti viene spesso imputata, no? Magari da quelli che sono i pensatori più raffinati, quindi non stiamo parlando di gente che magari usa la N-word in mezzo alla strada, stiamo parlando di persone che in teoria dovrebbero essere un po' istruite. E sì, questo è il commentino che ti viene dalla persona mediamente istruita. Il lavoro che facciamo tutti quanti, che poi alla fine non è solamente un lavoro, ma è anche una passione, è una vocazione, è un modo di riuscire a stare con dignità in questo mondo, viene percepito quindi anche in questa maniera, ovvero come un tentativo di provare a fare una scalata sociale in un mondo che relega alla tua condizione di figlia di immigrati straniera solamente lo spazio da occupare con le proteste sul razzismo. In realtà questa è una cosa che a me mi fa anche molto sorridere perché, come disse una volta Toni Morrison, cioè in questa intervista bellissima, la giornalista gli chiede ma come mai lei parla sempre di neri, di razzismo, insomma della sua comunità? E lei risponde appunto a questa domanda dicendo ma perché a uno scrittore bianco gli viene imputato di parlare sempre delle questioni dei bianchi? La mia è letteratura e io parlo di quello che io vivo, io parlo di quello che io sento, che io annuso, che io soffro, che io ho il coraggio di fronteggiare. Quindi fa molto, molto ridere questa cosa qui, però si sente veramente molto, molto spesso. C'è proprio questa accusa di essere poco genuine in questa lotta dove tra l'altro la poca genuinità purtroppo sta solamente dalla parte di chi finge di non capire, no? Di chi finge soprattutto di non comprendere che esiste, che il razzismo esiste ed è più forte che mai. E non si riduce purtroppo solamente alla parolina di troppo, la N-word, oppure agli episodi di microaggressione. Purtroppo è una cosa che uccide le persone, fondamentalmente, una cosa che taglia il futuro delle persone. Se voi pensate, per esempio, no, c'è stato il caso recentissimo della squadra di basket del mio paese di origine, ecco, Castelvolturno, si chiama la Tantam Basketball, e a loro per l'ennesima volta è stato impedito di poter partecipare alle gare nazionali perché i ragazzini hanno il permesso di soggiorno, non sono cittadini italiani. Allora ecco che tu praticamente stai accoltellando il futuro di ragazzini giovanissimi che cresceranno pensando che c'è qualcosa che non va in loro e che il paese in cui sono cresciuti non gli vuole dare nemmeno una possibilità di poter praticare una cosa così naturale, così spontanea come lo sport. Questi ragazzini non hanno la possibilità di fare questa cosa qua. Però se tu provi a questionare, a dire guarda, non sono le mie lamentele, non è la malizia che ho negli occhi, oppure un modo di essere troppo ipersensibili, ma è un sistema che taglia le gambe al futuro della gente, al presente della gente, anche al passato della gente, di un certo tipo di gente, cioè i neri, le persone, tra virgolette, che chiamano colorati, figli di immigrati, loro ti diranno di no, ti diranno che non è così, negheranno sempre questa cosa che invece è così palese e così dolorosa che solamente un folle potrebbe negarla.
Grazie Giara.
Grazie a te.
E allora, con Bola mi fa segno che dobbiamo chiudere. Yes, time is running up, but I would like to ask a very, very last question to Oida and Natasha. I know you've both replied to the questions that have come through, so thank you very, very much. So yes, there was a question that perhaps, I don't know if either of you would like to touch on, that's quite interesting about intersectionality. So because both of you have referenced the Italian citizenship reform in the context of institutional racism. So this question is interesting because it talks about intersectionality. So have you explored this in your work, particularly with the issue of the LGBTQ community, the recent DDL-ZAN also not getting enough votes, a striking resonance with the citizenship law reform that is struggling to go through. Any thoughts on this from either Oida or Natasha? Have you touched on intersectionality?
Okay. Yeah, definitely. The fact that the DDL-ZAN didn't pass is just the same thing as citizenship didn't pass. It seems like the government, the Italian government, doesn't care at all. Let me say this about the rights of the people that live here, whether they are foreign citizen or citizens that were born here by foreign parents or LGBT community. They just don't care. And the fact that so many people went protesting right after the DDL-ZAN didn't pass, it is an aspect that I want to underline, because the people, of course, wanted a law to pass. And the same thing happened with the citizenship. So we are still here struggling, talking about the citizenship, talking about the rights of LGBTQ people. But in Italy, we are very backwards, we can say that, because they do not care about the rights of people. And the problem is that, to me, especially when we talk about, again, intersectionality, we need to understand also that talking about representation here, usually the concept that a person may be Black and gay or Black and lesbian, it's not pretty much conceived. And when we talk about LGBT, even here, because you mentioned intersectionality, it is important also to underline that there are people of different descent in Italy that may have different sexual orientation, but they have to face two types of discrimination. So racism, systemic racism against them, and the fact that a state doesn't recognize their rights as being a person of the LGBT community. So you have two types of discrimination that you have to fight against. And so it is twice as hard for people coming from foreign descent being also maybe having a different sexual orientation. So the concept of intersectionality is very important to understand. But again, it mustn't be just like a concept put there, because even intersectionality has become kind of a trend, and it isn't supposed to be like that. It is supposed to be about the fight, about the struggle, about protesting, joining and going together, fighting for our own rights. And it's also a matter of not only about civil rights, but also social rights, the struggle of social class. Okay, so it is not, as I was trying to explain before, the Bossi-Fini law is something that, for example, really it involves people, especially foreign people that are from a specific social class. So being Black and poor and also LGBT, all of three together, of course, is something that needs to be taken into account. And the question of intersectionality must include also the question of class. This is very important to me. Yeah.
Thank you. Natasha, would you like to add quickly, has class or sexual orientation come up in your study about communities in Milan?
Yes, sorry, just to follow up on what Oisa was saying, completely agree with her. And especially I think there's also an issue on how we still talk about, as Northerners, I guess I'm including myself, the South, you know, and how that's talked about also on social media. That's quite problematic from people who define themselves as intersectional. Sorry, just talking very quickly. But just in short, no, I didn't really develop the question of intersectionality in my thesis on that level, looking into, let's say, gender and sexuality itself. I mean, yes, I did, but it was mostly, I think, the theme of religion as well. So not only class that I picked upon as well, and I couldn't really talk about it in my presentation, but there was an issue of, you know, rampage Islamophobia in general, not from all the participants, but there were one or two which kind of emphasized how Islamophobic discourse is also reproduced by certain communities. Yeah.
Great, thank you everyone. I think we really need to close the event for today, but we're gonna see, hopefully we're gonna see everyone back on Wednesday. So a big thank you to our speakers for their thought-provoking papers and fantastic discussion now. Yeah, so, and also just to remind us and everyone that the event was made possible by the Cardiff University School of Modern Languages and the Leverhulme Trust. And a big thank you to Combola, who really did the whole thing. And thank you to Professor Loredana Polezzi. There will be a survey as soon as you leave the webinar. So if you can spare a couple of minutes to do it, it will be helpful for us. It's just a couple of questions. And yeah, we hope to see all of you back on Wednesday. Same time as today for our second and final webinar, Black Voices Reclaiming Anti-Racist Spaces. Thank you, everyone.
Grazie.
Thank
Ciao.
you. Bye.
Bye bye.
Grazie a tutte.
Grazie a tutti.
Ciao, grazie.
Ciao, grazie.